Hey guys, I wanted this video to be a part of a whole bigger video which was called The Scholastic's Refutation of St. Anselm's Argument, the Ontological Argument specifically, but unfortunately that would have taken years, right? So I decided to limit it and I'm going to go portion by portion. So today we're going to be looking at Cajetan's refutation of St. Anselm. Now, Cardinal Cajetan, also known as Thomas de Vio Cajetan, Ordo Predicatorum, or it just means Order of Preachers. When you see that O.P sign, OP, it's pretty cool, right? So he was a cardinal and a philosopher and theologian during the Protestant Reformation, and he is actually the cardinal that went out to discuss with Luther on the 95 Theses when Luther was in opposition against the Catholic Church for indulgences and stuff. And so he was the one that debated Luther on several issues. And I think one of his most famous sayings against Luther was "Recanto, Luther," means like renounce your beliefs or heresy. So Cardinal Cajetan is a Thomist. Now, he's regarded as one of the most authoritative Thomists. Now, some scholastics, I know, some people, they do not regard him as a Thomist, as a strict observance Thomist, in a sense like, John of St. Thomas, because there is some views that he departs from St. Thomas, and I think some of those views were on marriage, but I have to look into that. But today we're just going to be covering his refutation of St. Anselm. But he does provide a brief good defense of St. Thomas, in my opinion. He does clash with Scotus a lot on his commentary on the Summa Theologiae. His works include, his commentary on De Ante Essentia, or on Being an Essence, which I would love to read in the future. But enough of that yapping. I was going to cover Jean-Baptiste Gonnet and other scholastic there's some people that actually translate these passages. So there was a translation of Simplius Thomisticae. I think it's called The Shoot of Thomism. But yeah, I was gonna get it, but today we're just gonna be covering Cajetan. So let's get started. So for some background information, Saint Anselm was another Christian philosopher, but he tried to prove God a priori, meaning from the cause instead of the effects. Now remember my earlier videos on epistemology, a priori is just knowledge independent of empirical justification, so it just means before. So this is known as the ontological argument, and these arguments try to prove God's existence independent of experience or effects, or they try to prove it from the cause. So a good example is Descartes' ontological argument from my video. Remember, I covered that. Descartes' argument just goes like this. God is a being that contains every perfection. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God contains existence. And he argues that existence necessarily belongs to God, right? Pure act being, and therefore God exists. That might sound oversimplified. That's why you should check out my argument, because we're not going to cover it here. So this is how Anselm's ontological argument proceeds. Premise 1. It is a conceptual truth, or, so to speak, true by definition, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. 2. That is, the greatest possible being that can be imagined. There's one more. God exists as an idea in the mind. 3. A being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. For, thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, that is, a greatest possible being that does exist. 5. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God, for it is a contradiction to suppose that we can imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that can be imagined. 6. Therefore, God exists. And I got this from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is another great site for philosophy. Stanford Encyclopedia, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, really good websites. Now, even before Cardinal Cajetan, Aquinas already criticized this argument, because not everyone who hears the word God understands it to mean something than which nothing greater can be conceived, because some people, like the pagans, thought that God was a body, and some people anthropomorphized God. Now here's another problem from Aquinas. Even if we accept the definition of God to mean something which nothing greater can be conceived, it doesn't follow that Anselm actually understands the significance or meaning of the word that it exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Now let's get to Cajetan's response to silence and Selmian resistance, and this is actually what he said in the Summa Theologiae, his commentary on the Summa Theologiae. So he is a Aquinas interpreter, so he does comment on a lot of Aquinas' works. He commented on the whole Summa Theologiae, and here's just like, one page of it. This is his commentary. But in his commentary, he provides brief refutations of Peter Ario, Scotus, a lot of clashing with Scotus, by the way. You'll see a lot of that. And then here's this where I got. This is what the slide's on, this page. So, Cajetan starts off by saying that some writers have tried to strengthen their argument by saying, according to you, what exceeds all thought does not exist, but inference, in that case, it does not outstrip every thinkable thing, which is contrary to what the term God means. And to support this, they say, because it doesn't outstrip an existing thinkable thing, and if it did exist, it would be thought greater than any conceivable thing. So layman terms, basically what the writers are saying is that if you say that whatever is beyond all thought doesn't exist, then it wouldn't actually be greater than everything we can think of. But that goes against what the name God means, because God is supposed to be greater than anything we can conceive of. And if God existed, he would be greater than anything we could think of. So saying he doesn't exist creates a contradiction. Now, Cajetan just says this is just a restatement of the original objection, so it can be met with the same response. So Cajetan starts by distinguishing two senses where outstripping every thinkable thing happens, and he separates this into two arenas. One, outstripping every thinkable thing or surpassing every thinkable thing happens, one, in the real or reality, that is actually, actual, and two, in being of thought, which is just conception. And he gives us the example, think of the traits of the perfect orator. They can be depicting him surpassing every orator in two ways. One, he could be surpassing them, in the real world or reality. Two, they can conceive of him surpassing every orator in thought or conception. So it's just mental or logical existence. In the first way, we have to say that the perfect orator exists, but in the second way, we don't have to, because it suffices that the perfect orator, that surpasses everyone, has the being or existence of an object in thought. Because we say that the basis for his advantage lies in the nobility of the conceived traits in themselves, so in the properties or attributes in themselves. So the premise, what exceeds every thinkable thing does not exceed, it perfectly follows that, therefore what exceeds every thinkable thing does not outstrip in real existence every thinkable thing. Now, in the defense of Anselm's argument, writers say it would be a greater thinkable if it actually existed in the real or in reality. Cajetan blatantly rejects this and says no. So Cajetan says this type of response or rejoinder only comes from either mistaking the sense we give to the word God, or of their ignorance of the difference between signified act and exercised act. So signified act is just the mental or conceptual act or existence or of referring to a thing. So it's not real existence but merely conception. Exercised act is referring to actual real existence, the thing really is in reality. So Cajetan concedes that what is meant and thought is a thing greater than every other conceivable thing, having every perfection and even that of existence in the real, but only in signified act. So they're conceiving it in signified act. Even if you were to say, well, this being that is greater than any other conceivable being, and we conceive of it even having real existence, it's still not going to get you out of that you're conceiving it in signified act. Now, even if you say from X it is meant as blah blah blah, and X is thought of as blah blah blah, just replace that with the word God. God is meant as the most perfect being, the greatest possible being or greatest conceivable thing. There would still not be a valid inference to the claim that X actually exists. That is why St. Thomas says this argument proves nothing. The enemies of this argument do not concede that such a being exists in the real or reality, but they do concede that such being is signified, meaning that it's conveyed in and thought of as existing. So that's what is meant by the distinction between signified act and exercised act. And if it did exist, it would not be greater, because all that would occur would be that what is only in thought would exist. For example, suppose that the noblest animal is what we want to prove that it exists just from the terms used. The argument would be like this. The noblest animal exists. This is also kind of similar to Ganilo's objection, by the way, with the island. Now, back to the example, or the argument. The noblest animal exists, because if it didn't, it would then be the noblest of animals. Now, still here, the advantage, the basis for being nobler, is the nobility of the thing met in itself. And being in thought and being in real are just two arenas, two different areas of the very noble thing meant. So basically what Cajetan is saying is that the nobility we are talking about is in the idea or concept, but not actually in the real creature. Just because something is signified as X or meant as X doesn't mean that it is. Or what he means by doesn't mean that it is means that doesn't mean that it actually exists. And finally, Cajetan gives us a refutation from a logical linguistic point of view, where a thing greater than any other thinkable thing implies real existence either in exercised act or signified act. Signified act is conceded but not exercised act, because if we take the first, then the proposition is self-verifying. However, the sentence a thing greater than any other thinkable thing does not imply existing in exercised act, but only in though or conceptual, because it is a noun phrase, right? A noun phrase is something, it's meant as conceived. And so it's something that gives you place, person, or thing as a concept, but doesn't presuppose that it actually exists in reality. And as Cajetan beautifully puts it, things meant by nouns are meant as conceived, while things meant by verbs are meant as exercised. So he gives us two propositions. Existence does not exist. This isn't a contradiction because it's just a noun phrase. But the proposition what there is does not exist is a contradiction because it's exercise. It's a verb, right? So verbs are meant as exercised, nouns are meant as conceived. And that's basically the end of the video. So again, if you just want a quick recap, this is basically Cajetan's refutation of St. Anselm, right? So the statement, God is the greatest conceivable thing, which no other, other thing can be more conceived as greater. It's just a noun phrase. It's just meant as conceived, right? And there's no valid inference to that it actually exists, right? When we're going back to saying that, X is meant as blah, 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 and X is thought of blah, blah, blah. It's a non sequitur to go from that to that X exists. Because when we conceive of something having maximal perfection, or, the greatest thing that can be conceived, which, it happens in two areas, either in the real or signified. And Cajetan concedes the second, right? He doesn't concede that this actual being exists, even though he does believe God exists. He doesn't believe that, you can conceive of it and therefore it exists. He believes that, he does concede that what is meant is that is that God is the greatest conceivable being in signified act, right? And therefore it doesn't follow that this being would actually exist in exercise act, and that would require demonstration or disputatio. And that's basically the refutation of St. Anselm by Thomas de Cajetan. And that's basically it. Thanks for watching.